For those key, more executive level hires, 90% of them come from people within the network or customers of ours that we built relationships with.
Are most of those great people you're hiring at those senior levels posted roles, or are they not?
Depending on the level of seniority, I would say VP and up, typically not posted. If the major driver is title, I'm not sure that's exactly what you want.
You mentioned you had a favorite interview question.
I'm going to give you 3 minutes. In those 3 minutes, I want you to tell me who you are and why you're here. I love the concept of a bar raiser, just kind of like pop somebody.
Shake them a little bit, yeah.
What you'll find is the people that really know their shit do not get uncomfortable.
Welcome to How I Hire, the podcast where we talk with senior go-to-market leaders about how they find, vet, attract, and grow new talent. I'm Andy Mowat, founder of Whisper. Today, I'm joined by James Roth. James is a revenue leader who rose from knocking on doors as an outside sales rep to C-suite as ZoomInfo's chief revenue officer. They actually also just retitled their ticker on the NASDAQ to GTM. So we've got the CRO at the company that is the GTM ticker. James has spearheaded enterprise sales growth at Vonage. And now he drives ZoomInfo's go-to-market strategy. James, I've gotten to know you working with your team, buying ZoomInfo a lot of times, and really respect you a lot. So great to have you here.
Yeah, Andy, thanks for having me. Great to see you. Always great to catch up.
That's great. Well, maybe we started off just kind of at the strategic level, talking about how do you design an executive role successfully? How do you think about when do you start to realize you need another executive hire?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the size that ZoomInfo is, as a large publicly traded company, the executive suite is pretty well known, if you will. But I think we're constantly looking at, especially in the SVP ranks, where do we need one? Where do we not need one? I think in great times, a lot of companies exploded with, chief business officer, chief customer officer, chief revenue officer, chief sales officer. And, I think a lot of those were done, not that those are incorrect roles or titles. I think in different businesses, they make a ton of sense, so long as they're clearly defined. And I think for at least a lot of companies that grew very quickly and you've got all these different people and, great success, high growth, ZERP era, et cetera, those titles were just given out almost as like a retention thing to say, hey, you've been doing a good job. You're kind of a VP or an SVP, but we'll give you this title, even though you're going to report into 3 other C-suite people. And so I think being incredibly prudent around what is this executive role and exactly what are they doing. And I think that chief customer versus chief revenue versus chief sales, if you're going to have them, great. And it's not wrong to have them, but I think understanding if they're peers or if they report into one another, understanding those roles and responsibilities. And, if we need to go hire someone and the prerequisite is it is a C-suite title, even though in Workday it's an SVP title, then so be it. You do what you have to do. But I think my point of view, whether that's contrarian or not, is if the major driver is title, I'm not sure that's exactly what you want, where I would personally much rather go bigger on compensation or some of those areas, because I think LinkedIn these days, and, I'm sure we've all seen it, it's actually, we do a lot of business because of this, seeing the actual hierarchy and seeing where people actually sit in an organization in this world where there's so many of these particular titles, could be vanity titles. It makes it really challenging to understand who's doing what. And I think that becomes pervasive in an org unless it's very clearly defined. So I think when do we need this particular role? If you've got a retention problem and you need someone very senior to run the customer business, great. That is the right thing to do. And we want to go hire someone that has that particular skill set. But as far as that business, does it report into revenue? Does it report into, customer? Does it report into COO? Understanding that hierarchy and what are those metrics? And I think as a chief customer officer, we've been through that realm where if the chief revenue officer owns the retention outcome and they own the renewal and they own the growth and all of those things, and then you have a chief customer officer that just runs CSMs, and the CSMs have somewhat opaque metrics or whatever it may be, the misalignment there can be potentially catastrophic. Where yes. Aligning them into, okay, CSMs, they own this portion of the renewal. Do they own the renewal? Do they own the renewal outcome? And then the AM owns upsell. I think you've got to be very clear on that. And I think you get a lot more leverage in having a single leader that owns the overall customer business, including growth, including downsell, including retention. The more separate they are, and I use this term a lot, like the more there's micro metrics that do not align to the overall metrics that matter, I think you find yourself in a difficult position.
Man, I agree with everything you said. I actually would not, I would shy away from, and I got a lot of people to shy away from the CEO that is the decider across GTM, right? Like I want to work for somebody like you that is thinking through, because the CEO has so many other things externally that's pulling them apart that it's hard to get them there. So I deeply agree with that. Something else you said that resonated with me was the title focus. I think there's obviously like if you're titling a director or something lower, then that truly is a more junior title. But I oftentimes see people like, I want the SVP because I've been VP before. And I'm like, if you enter that way, A, you have a target on your back. B, you shouldn't be driven by titles. You should be driven by impact. I'd be curious a little bit more, like, how do you think about titling people? If people are over obsessed over the titles, is that a red flag for you? How do you think about that?
I mean, I think some of it comes to maturity, where if you ever go into an interview, whether you're interviewing with a board, whether you're interviewing for a senior position, they'll never ask you what your title is.
Yes.
They ask you what your remit is. They ask you what you oversee. Do you have this? Do you have that? How many people? What's the revenue? And I think it's almost like this maturation curve where in the manager, senior manager, director, senior director, I think everybody totally fine. You want that senior director, you want that positive movement up. I'm okay with that. But then I think as you get into VP and SVP and again, C-suite or quasi C-suite within C-suite, if you will, you start to realize how little it actually does matter.
Agreed. Yeah.
It comes down to knowledge, skill set, purview, remit. There are CROs out there that just have sales. In some cases, they just have new business sales. And then you've got all of these other people that own these other things. And so that might feel great to have a CRO title. But when you go in and you get the headhunted for some big public, global CRO gig, and they're like, okay, what's your remit? Well, I've got a CRO title. They don't care. I just have new business. Versus, call me something else. But if I've got marketing, if I've got customer success, if I've got CX in general, if I've got delivery, if I've got partnerships, I think you start to hit a level of maturity where you realize that is all that matters.
Yes.
And so I think, to your question, again, talked about LinkedIn, it is not lost on me that it is very important to a lot of people because, you come up through the ranks and you want your friends or you want your in-laws or whomever to see this big title. But I think it does then become pervasive in the sense that, you see it on LinkedIn all the time, like SDR to VP in 3 months, and they're a VP, they're an individual contributor at a very small company, and they're a sales team of 1. But that title looks really flashy, and so they're happy about it. And I think that's the wrong thing to chase. And throughout my career, I've always joked, call me a janitor. If I'm learning, if I'm getting access to go build and drive things that I haven't necessarily built or driven before, it is a very long game of accumulating skill sets. And I think that comes out in an interview process very quickly. And I've had some of these where it's like every question I ask, it somehow leads back to whatever their title is. And I'm like, I don't care what your title is. Have you done this thing before? And if you haven't, that's okay, because everybody grows into these particular roles. And so you're interviewing more so for what do you know? What are your superpowers? What are your gaps? And then, give me an example of when you had a gap before that you leaned into and you learned it and you talked to a lot of really smart people and you started doing it. That, I think, is what you want to hire for versus I was an SDR and I became a VP. And so
I couldn't agree more. I give the speech a lot to people, the 1 versus 2. Are you sure you want to be C-level at a crappy little company, or do you want to go one step bigger and take a step down and work for people that are great? Which I think the other thing that I kind of ideated when you were talking was the numbers you own are more important than your title, for sure.
100%.
You guys have you talked earlier about how you structure roles and are really thoughtful on them. At the same time, I've seen you hire some great athletes too, right? I maybe not at the C-level, but I've observed a couple people that have been founders before that are now at ZoomInfo. And I'm curious, I don't know, maybe they're a little bit more on the product side. But I've watched some of those people that I've been really impressed with in my career end up going to ZoomInfo for a role that. And so I'm curious, how do you think about hiring athletes that are just going to kill it, that may not have a specific functional vertical, versus hiring for that function that has done that before?
Yeah. So I think two things. One, one of our core company principles is be entrepreneurial.
Yeah.
And I think that is in our ethos, and we're still founder led. And so that ability to take someone, we just hired a great GM of our talent business that was a former, founder, CEO of a talent company.
I know John well. He's a great guy. Yeah.
Outstanding. He's actually here in our office in Bethesda today. I think there is a level of grit and resilience, and not to necessarily get buzzwordy, but if you've done that and we go say, hey, you're the GM of this business, you've got limited resources, and it's kind of like grow and get more. If you said that to somebody who's coming from 10 years at Salesforce, where it's like, wait, what? We would rather have that sort of founder entrepreneurial grit that says, okay, I get the mission. In real life, I go show results and I can go hire more people. And then I show more results and I hire more people. I think that role and that background, whether it's acqui-hires, whether it's, bringing folks in that were former founders, there's just a level of get up and go that sometimes folks that have the, 20 years at huge publicly traded company might not have. And it's not to say either one is right or wrong. I think it's a culture thing. And as a founder-led, sort of high intensity business, it's a lot easier to just find people that fit into that versus trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. You bring up athletes, I know in this context, but I do think, the actual, sort of athletes, a lot of people are like, hey, I only want to hire collegiate athletes. I think one of the things in a complete rabbit hole, anything that's performance mindset driven, and this is not to, I guess, rub people the wrong way, but I do think, and maybe I'm dating myself, but everybody gets a trophy, everybody's great. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to be some athlete, but whether it's, music, whether it's, performance, anything where you are accustomed to having somebody tell you, Andy, you didn't do your best, whether that's in film, whether that's, we hired someone who was like a, professional ballerina, and you think about the intensity and just like that performance mindset of, I'm accustomed to being given bad feedback. I'm accustomed to being told I didn't do that at its best. I'm accustomed to saying, okay, I did this poorly. I'm going to be told that I did it poorly, and then I'm going to learn so I do it better the next time. I think there's a lot of things within a background where you can see that not only in their work experience, but even pre their work experience. And so I think that is something that I put a premium on, because there's a great meme that's like, everybody wants feedback until it's constructive feedback. Everybody just wants good feedback. And I do think there is a cohort of the population that has never really had that performance mindset to be like, I was a football player. If I had a horrible game and we go into the tape session, they're not going to be like, James, you tried your best. You did great, right? They're going to go through every step that I missed. They're going to go through every block that I missed. And then you better believe the next game I wouldn't do it again. And so I think bringing some of that back into the fold, there are indicators throughout the process or throughout a background that can allow you to know some of those things, so that when you are in that, back to the, founder entrepreneurial, those folks are dealing with it every day, because it's their investors, it's the people that, whomever is backing them to start that company or build that company, they're not getting easy feedback.
I love that. I may go off on a tangent a little bit, but it's like there's a lot of these 35-year-old biz ops people that have been judging other people their whole time, but they've never been held accountable to a number, right? And it's like, it feels really good. You want those ambiguous roles, but I think those are really hard to build careers on. Sorry to rant on biz ops here, but
I agree.
Let's talk a little bit about like how you find talent and how talent finds you. I'm also really excited to get to how you evaluate talent, because I know we were talking about that earlier. But how do you go about finding somebody in this market, right? A public company, great brand. I mean, you guys could see 2, 3, 4,000 applicants for a senior level role. Are most of those great people you're hiring at those senior levels posted roles, or are they not?
Yeah, so I think depending on the level of seniority, I would say VP and up, typically not posted.
Agreed. Yeah.
I think below VP, typically posted. And I think it's a combination of, incremental net new role. Sure, we'll post it. But I think as far as where we find talent and where we find the best talent, we have a unique advantage in the sense that, especially for go-to-market, oftentimes we're selling to CMO, we're selling to marketing ops, we're selling to rev ops, we're selling to CRO, we're seeing sales leadership. And so I would say some of our best hires are from just folks that we know. When I was promoted into the role, I knew exactly who I was going to hire as my backfill because I had been tracking him, trying to hire him, keeping track of him for basically 3 years, and had known him. It was a referral. And so I think in this business, in the business that we're in, or like Andrew Riesenfeld, who I know you know well, he was our customer at DocuSign. And so we knew him. We had worked with him. He was a customer of ours. He knew ZoomInfo inside and out. Many people in the organization knew him. And so I think, for those key, more executive level hires, I would say 90% of them come from people within the network or customers of ours that we built relationships with, because the devil you know is always better than the devil you don't. And so we'll take a mixture. Again, at that executive level, we will sometimes bring in like an executive search firm to get the wider net of the people that we may not know. But then I would say oftentimes we'll have 8 to 10 people that we know from being customers, from our network, from, referrals, if you will, of people that have just gotten into the ecosystem. And it's one of the benefits of being a larger company that a lot of folks have used over the years. And so, those are some of our key impact hires. And then when they connect internally as well. So Steve Antuna was the guy that I hired to replace me. I'd been interviewing for him for different roles for basically years at a time. And he also worked with Andrew back at Responsys and, in his past life. And so I think those are the best hires because that there's a culture fit, that they know our product inside and out, that there's a network effect of, they know some of these folks coming in. And so, every now and again, we will find great hidden gem talent from the executive search firm and things like that. And then I think for the posted roles, the sort of senior director and below, to your point, our brand, people that have used us, there's a simplicity at ZoomInfo, even when I joined. I was interviewing at kind of like the biggest of the big, went through the Amazon thing. And then this was Q4 of 2021. So there's a lot of the next going to be $10 billion IPOs, bunch of Series B, Series C. And then ZoomInfo was right in the middle. It was like a post-IPO, good size, 3,200 employees at the time. What drew me to ZoomInfo, aside from all of those other places I was working with, is that I knew the product. I had deployed the product to my sales teams. You mentioned in the intro, I started as an outside sales rep knocking on doors with zero information. And so when we implemented ZoomInfo to our go-to-market, it was like, holy crap, we don't need to send all of these 22-year-olds out to go knock on doors. We can be a lot more targeted. And so there was like a fondness, if you will, but also there was a level of comfort where I could go in and tell that story very quickly. And I think we get a benefit from that on the go-to-market side. Not necessarily the same if you're an engineer and you go work at Datadog or something else like that. Probably a similar affinity. And so we get a lot of leverage off of that brand awareness, the people that have used it, the people that have built sales careers off of it. So hopefully that answers your question.
I love it. It's actually, you identified a pattern that I'd never verbalized before, but people are always like, how do I network? And I'm like, well, one way to do it is get to know the vendors that are selling to you, right? Because they're going to have dinners. They're going to, if you love their product, I think that's probably how you and I met, right? Like you guys were selling Carta. I got to know you. Your team at some point was like, hey, you should meet James. And like, we built a relationship off of that. And I think that's an area that people undersell. They're like, I don't like to buy software. I actually, some of my best relationships in life have come from software I've either been selling to people or been buying from and built those relationships. So I think it's like it's a hidden gem, right? Like Riesenfeld at some point, if I'm saying his last name right, probably at some point like had a conversation with you or one of the ZoomInfo team, and really he impressed them with how he knew about the product, I'm guessing. And so then you just the relationships go from there. So I like that. It's a fun tactic for executives. It's not a short-term tactic, it's a long-term tactic, but I think it's a really neat one for sure.
No, absolutely. And one thing you touched on, which is a great hidden avenue, is the great salespeople that try to sell us. Somebody sends me an email or gives me a call that I actually resonate with the value proposition. They get a hold of me. I will go hire those folks all the time if they're great. And then in the actual deal cycle, if there's a sales leader, I think we've all been on the other end of enough sales meetings that probably didn't go great, that when you have that one that's just like uniquely great, I just put them in my thing. Maybe it's not the right time. Maybe they got a huge deal and they want to make their commission. They're going to President's Club, but I stay on them. And then I go to our CTO, I go to our CIO, I go to our CPO, and I constantly ask them, best salespeople you guys have seen, best demos you've seen. It's an unbelievable way to find great talent, or to your point, the people selling to you when you're hiring for salespeople, or from a marketing standpoint. Like if you see amazing content, if you see a great campaign, if you see brand that is, evolved over time, who's running that? And so I think there's enough of a network effect, to your point, that's low-hanging fruit that's already out there, that a lot of times people don't take advantage of.
I agree. You touched on how do you find great salespeople from people who are selling you? You actually perked up a question I was about to skip over, and I'm glad I didn't. What are the ways people can get to you? So say there's a great like VP plus level role within ZoomInfo, and people want to find creative ways to get to James, right? Is that DMing you? Is that backdoor? Is that relationships? Like what has worked in the past to get to you and break through the noise?
I think probably the number one play is a relationship.
Yeah.
They know someone who knows me.
Yeah.
And so it kills some of that noise of, okay, this is differentiated. Like, hey, I know Andy really well. Andy said you guys are pals. I will respond to that, because it almost adds like a layer of accountability. It's human nature where it's like, I don't want this person going back to Andy being like, that guy James a real jerk because he didn't even respond to me. And so it's almost like adding one of those things in, alma mater, like the personalization. I've got an affinity for folks, whether it was high school or college, like similar to the relationship, where if there's some degree of, I've done a little bit of homework and I know that we share this thing, whether it's a friend, whether it's a colleague, whether we overlapped at a certain company, there's the like, okay, I respond to that because I'm a student of the game. I love the fact that they've done their homework, but there's also just that, again, additional layer of accountability where it's like, okay, if this person went to school with me, or, even if they graduated in 2017, I graduated in 2009, there's still like a bond there. And then from an actual like channel perspective, I'm sure your LinkedIn inbox looks like mine. I'm 98% not going to respond to that just because of the just sheer volume, where I'm much more on text, like text message. And I'm probably going to hate myself depending on who listens to this, but text messages far and away, I've got 0 unread in my inbox. I will always respond to text messages because they're the cleanest way for me to see email. I've got an EA that thankfully, and I've got an AI agent that sits over my email, but it's so hard, even at scale, to find out like which of these are legitimate, which aren't. And so, text messages are usually the way that I get most of I'll respond immediately. And it's impossible for me to like forget that it's there. And
that's funny. I'm the exact opposite. Text messages, there's nothing to save them. So if I get too many, I think for me, the way I've limited text is I only have 20 people that I text with, right? I limit who can come in that first door. But the irony is you can go on ZoomInfo and find pretty much anyone's cell phone number. So it's an interesting one that I guess people just don't abuse it in the way they abuse email, maybe is the way that it stays sane.
I think so. I think the likelihood that somebody, because there's a personal aspect to it. And I think that's where that combination of there's a reason, whether it's a relationship, whether it's some overlap, like if I get that text and there is a, hey, I'm good buddies with Andy, he told me to reach out to you. I don't think I have, and maybe I'm different from others, but I don't have a visceral reaction to that. Email, my likeliness to respond or my likelihood to respond is just lower because the chances that I see it or miss it, I'm sure you're the same way, even with AI, even with an EA, all of those things. I open up an email, I look at the top. Is this a customer? Is this somebody selling to me? I look at the bottom, I look at their title, and I don't read the body of the email for the most part. I just do like a quick scan, which is hard. Like I'm sure I've missed great stuff. And so there's like a persistence to it as well, where some people get irritated if it's like, hey, checking in again. I actually appreciate that because odds are the first time I got it, I didn't see it.
That's huge. Especially with text. You're right. Like if it hits again, I think maybe with text, it's like you've let people in that you already have dialogues with, whereas email's just so full of everything else.
Yes.
Well, let's shift to interview, kind of like how you evaluate. And it was really fun talking before the podcast just around how you think about evaluating, raising the bar and all that. I'd love to hear your philosophy before I go deep on specific questions.
Yeah, I think a couple of the first principles, and my entire leadership team, they're probably going to make fun of me because I say this all the time. As far as like your day to day, it is an always on, always looking for talent, always looking, always interviewing, constantly looking. And, they'll always be closing. I've also got an always be looking for talent. And there's so much of it. And like we've tried to formalize this as much as possible, but there's so many great people that are somehow connected to us that we're probably not thinking about on a regular basis. And so you look at the impact that a great hire has and just resonating across the org with an impact hire. So that's one of the first principles is that I don't care what level you're in, what role you're a frontline manager, you're CRO, like constantly looking. And I keep track of like how many people have you brought in from your network. I think it's a great indicator, by the way, of like, did you make a good hire? Do people actually want to follow them? Can they bring people over? And again, non-compete, non-solicit, non-recruit aside, there's still the like, I've worked with James before. I want to go work with James again. And so I think that's always a great indicator. But that's first principle number one is always be on the lookout. As far as the actual, and forgive my vulgarness, but there's like a level of interview porn that has come out where it's, Amazon, you've got all these like books about interviews and the process. And I feel like the process becomes overbearing. Yes. And I went through Amazon's and it's an amazing company. There's nothing against them, but like having to commit all 13 of their core principles and have 2 stories to each of them. Then you go through 9 interviews, you got a bar raiser. I like to pick certain areas out of those things. Like I love the concept of a bar raiser. And even before Amazon, I didn't know what it was called at the time. But my old chief sales officer at like the first company I ever worked for, great guy. And he would have this motion where the interview would be going great. And it was almost like he'd come out and verbally just kind of like pop somebody. Where
shake them a little bit. Yeah.
100%. Something you said, he had this like calculator thing. I love that, especially interviewing salespeople where they, 300% to quota, this, that, and the next. And he would literally come out and be like, Andy, great, 300% to quota. Pull your calculator out. How'd you get there? Like what was your actual quota? What was the attainment? When were you on ramp? And just going that layer deeper. And from a core principle standpoint, that is salespeople in general should be great at selling. And they should be the best at selling themselves. And so the ability to go a layer deeper and then a layer deeper where these, high level 300% to plan. Okay, well, that was in 2024. You started in Q4. So your ramp, you probably had a 0 quota and maybe you sold one thing, which got you to 300%. There's so much noise in that. And I think the comfort level of making people just a little bit uncomfortable, not adversarial, not hostile, not making them feel bad. But if you do this and you take somebody that actually was 300% to plan, they will tell you exactly what their quota was. They'll tell you the deal that got them into Accelerator 2. They'll tell them the deal that got them into Accelerator 3. You will see that come out. And then, it was November and I was 180% to plan. And then I had this one deal. And then, they'll go through a level of detail where you're like, okay, this is real. Versus you ask the person that just like, nobody's ever going to check me on this. You ask that person and they'll melt down. I've had people just start sweating. I've had people that just fumble and get like confrontational. And so it's like a really nice way, the old calculator test, to just be like, walk me through that attainment. You see,
Here's one thing I layer on top of it. I give them a false choice, which is I'll say I'm going to pick 3 words, or in your case, and so I gave some guy the other day, it was like attribution, ROI, and like funnel conversion, right? And he picked ROI. And so my thing is, as soon as you pick one, I can go as deep as I want on that question. And so I think versus if you just say, great, let me go deep on the calculator, like, but I guess it's like when somebody professes knowledge, which I guess maybe in your case they are, that's when I feel like I can really rip them apart is kind of how I look at that.
100%. And I think it's just, quota on salespeople is one thing. But then if you're looking at, from a RevOps or any particular role, there is a level of depth needed. And I think that getting or having the comfort level of going to a level of depth that makes them quasi uncomfortable. What you'll find in that, whether it's ROI, whether it's attribution, what you'll find is the people that really know their shit do not get uncomfortable. And they will sit there and that interview will fly by because you end up nerding out on some really interesting stuff. Or you'll have the folks that will try to, politician their way. Well, I'm not, I didn't really own that part of it. That was this person. And you just start to see it's kind of like a killing 2 birds with 1 stone, because not only do you see their level of depth on the subject, you also get to see how they operate under pressure with some adversity. And, I'm sure you've had it too. You see some of these people just implode. And it's like, if you're imploding in a pretty simple question on something that, by the way, you put in your resume or on your LinkedIn, how are you going to operate when push comes to shove in like a real situation? And so, I love those types of things, not to make people uncomfortable, but just to see, like, if you and I were to go back and forth and just have a 30-minute conversation on a topic, again, that thing will feel like 30 seconds. We'll be talking about stories. We'll be talking like, that is, I always loved, like, tell me about your 2 biggest deals. Tell me about your 2 worst deals. And just seeing like the passion that people talk about it with versus the lack of passion that other people talk about it with. It has nothing to do with charisma. It has nothing to do with their showmanship. It just has to do with, like, are you obsessed with your craft? And I could tell you year by year, every single year since I have been working, I could tell you the biggest deal in that particular year that either I closed as an IC or my team closed if I was a manager or my region closed or my whatever. And then you have people that don't or can't. And it's like, oh, I don't have a great memory. And it's like, okay, and I'm not going to give them a hard time for not having a great memory. But if you go into some of those things, it's just a great way to judge for depth.
Yeah, it's also those people often are like the people that are a year and change. So you've never gone deep. You mentioned you had a favorite interview question. Did you already say it, or one that stumped you at some point in your journey, James?
No. So, this is a great story. I first company I started with, I spent 6 years there. And so I had not interviewed, and I had risen through the ranks there, and I got to like a VP level. And so, of course, I did what every dumb person does. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm this big shot. I'm a VP now, to the title thing. And so I went into this interview quasi ill-prepared. And I knew that the chief sales officer, we had worked together, we had competed, and, I knew that he wanted me. So then I was going into one of his key lieutenants, and I sat down and I figured it would be more of like a him selling me program. Big mistake. And he hits me with a question where he says, I'm going to give you 3 minutes. In those 3 minutes, I want you to tell me who you are and why you're here. And that was it. And I just bombed. I think I went like 7 minutes, and I was talking about like my family, and I just missed it. And Google has one of these, and the whole like, tell me about yourself. But then there's like 1,000 hours of YouTube on how to answer that question at Google. I've started using that right after that interview happened, because I botched it. And I think he knew that the CISO wanted to hire me, or the CSO wanted to hire me. And so he was like, why don't you try that again? And I'll give you another chance. And so what I learned is I was like, okay, can I have 2 to 3 minutes to think about it? He said, absolutely. And that was like a good thing, because it's like, you got 3 minutes. And especially in anything that you're presenting, the ability to like collect your thoughts, put them down on paper. And again, in the who you are and then why you're there, it's basically like a combination of you as an individual, your background, your work background, and then what's brought you to that place. And whether it's 1 minute, whether it's 5 minutes, the time boundedness of it really does allow you to see how people formulate their thoughts. Do they stay on message? Do they get lost down rabbit holes? And I think a lot of the positions that you look for, you have to have that, whether you're in sales, whether you're, in leadership, you have to be able to relay your points. And so I think it's a nice kind of fun way to start an interview off. And it's not as broad as Google, where they just say, Andy, tell me about yourself. And then if you don't hit exactly what they think you should hit, you're out. It's more constructive to give you some level of framework to say, you got to answer these 2 questions and you have a definitive amount of time, and you learn so much in that. So I love that one. It's probably one of my favorites just to kick an interview off.
Do you think it works without that? I love the time-bounded concept. Do you think it works without it?
I think it depends on what you're looking for.
Yeah.
I think it would be an interesting proxy for, is this going to be one of these guys that can talk for 40 minutes straight without letting anybody get a word in? Or is this going to be somebody that's like, I'm from Virginia and I'm doing this and I'm here because? And so I think it's an interesting take on it. And I think it's absolutely a lever depending on the person that you could take the time out of it. I always just like the time to see where are they going to focus? Are they going to get lost? And are they going to stick to 3 minutes? If they do it in 1 minute versus 3, how good are they? And again, especially in a lot of these, just for the record, is based in sales or go to market.
Yeah.
Because in sales, I always joke with the team, you've got your 30-second elevator pitch. You've got your 2 minutes at cocktails. You've got 5 or 10 minutes on stage, and you got a 30-minute presentation. And great salespeople kind of know when to tap into each of those things, knowing the situation. And so I've always liked time bounding it, just because it's here's your 2 minutes at a cocktail party, or here's your 3 minutes at a cocktail party, and I need to know this and this. How you get there is your choice. But if I've finished those 3 minutes and you've done a nice job of letting me know who Andy is and why we're talking today, there's a lot of different pathways to make that great. But you just get to see kind of how their mind works, how they articulate their thoughts, how they present their thoughts, and if they can stay kind of on message.
I like it. And to your point on make it a little bit uncomfortable, I think that the time bounded, I scribbled it down from that perspective. It puts that discomfort. The other one I always love is, in your own words, describe the role you're interviewing for. I'm often if I'm the last interview in the process, I think that's a great one. And half the people take themselves out on that. They just kind of mumble and grumble. We were talking about CEO bottleneck, right? What do you care about in the interview process? What does a CEO care about and how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think back to interview porn again. A lot of these self-help books on how to interview, there's the CEO signs off on every hire.
Yeah.
And that became a really big, cool thing. And a couple of great companies did it. I worked for a company that did that. And, what you find is that every hire, big companies hire a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And so the likelihood that CEO is actually going to be spending the time looking at the resumes of each of these and looking through the interview notes. So it becomes this slowdown in the process. And from a candidate experience, if you're waiting for an offer and the CEO's in, Bangalore, and they're behind and they've got this list of 30 people they need to approve, and then it requires meetings. And then, at one point we had a meeting every Wednesday to go through all the people to see, I feel it introduces so much process that it becomes a bottleneck. And then I think the thing that irked me most is then it's the old well, I got to prove that I am looking. So I'm going to cherry pick this one resume and I'm going to go hard at this particular person, whether I like them or I don't, but I got to let the team know that I'm actually not just rubber stamping all these things. I think it loses its power if it becomes just a step that we feel like we said, so we have to do it. What I am a huge advocate of, and so I think about the folks that I want to be a part of, are the areas in the segments or the particular BUs that are most important to me. So right now we're in this march up market. We're shifting from heavyweight SMB into up market. And so if I said, okay, I'm going to sign off and I'm going to interview every single person that we hire, it would be a disaster. However, if I say in these particular areas, mid-market VIP, enterprise core, enterprise VIP, anything in that high upmarket area, especially leaders, like people that I'm going to be interacting with, obviously anybody in my directs or a layer down, like VP and above, upmarket, the bottom line is like pick your spots in those areas where you want to give autonomy to your leadership to make the right hires. And then pick your spots where you are absolutely going to be actually engaged in all of the hiring. And I don't think there's like an in-between. And so right now, we're doing a big return to office push. So anybody remote, I have to be a part of. Because your point on the every year, I had this happen real time where somebody was like, hey, this person's amazing. They're amazing and they're remote and we want to hire them. I look at the person, they've had 5 jobs in 4 years. And clearly, and I'm like, I'm not sticking my neck out on the line for a remote hire for somebody that clearly is like this. So anybody remote, because I know that I'm going to get questioned heavily. And so there's that aspect of it where I want to see XYZ 1, 2, 3 from any remote hiring that we do. And then market, even manager and above, I'm going to be included in that process because those are going to be the people that will take us to that next level as we continue to move up market. And then there's a whole cohort of people that I have unilateral trust that my teams, their leadership, they can go hire the right people for what they need. And it allows me to actually go deeper in those areas versus like, I'm James, here's all this great interview stuff, and I approve every hire because I care so much. Of course, I care about every hire. But from a time perspective, there's no way with the amount of hiring that we do that I could have any real depth on those particular things. So that's just one of those contrarian views. And, Ken Griffin at Citadel still interviews everybody. Size of company, like what those individuals are doing. I think picking those spots and like how involved Ken is in each of those hires. Like it might sound good in a podcast, but I think picking those spots that are incredibly important to the company, to you, to your success, and those areas that like if somebody misses and there is a bad hire, I cannot hold them accountable in one of those key important roles. If this director of enterprise stinks, if I wasn't a part of that, it's very hard for me to hold them accountable, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So that you just touched on something interesting. Have there been times, and I've had them, where you are not the hiring manager, it's somebody beneath you. You disagree with the hire, but you still let them make it, or will you overrule in those cases?
There's a couple of prerequisites that I have. And there was a LinkedIn post that got a lot of traction, probably 6 months ago, about the like job jumper versus like the old dinosaurs that stay at companies for a long time. I'm not going to weigh in on what is right or wrong, but I have a very strong opinion on the every 9 months there's a new job, especially in go-to-market.
Yeah.
Because unlike some of these other areas, and sales well, you get hired, you got a 6-month ramp, then you got 3 months of performance improvement plan. And like the amount of times that lightning strikes that like, oh, the management, oh, it was a riff, oh, it was this, oh, it was that. Like there is an aspect where I will overrule because I refuse to be the 6th in 6 years. And it's going to happen. The data shows it. We've got an amazing HR data team here that goes through that. And if someone has a certain, there are proxies for this. If somebody has a certain number of jobs in a certain number of years, their tenure is going to be almost the exact same as it was at their last companies. And so I will overrule in that standpoint. If somebody just doesn't have their best day and they don't interview well, or maybe they just have an off day, I'll typically give them another chance if that hiring manager pushes back really hard. A couple of things like if they show up ill-prepared, looking like crap, or they're late, some of those things, like call me old school, I'll have a very visceral reaction to, because again, it's your craft. If you take this seriously, you should probably be on time. And if you're not on time for this, you're probably not going to be on time for your customer meetings or so on and so forth. So there's a couple of those, but outside of that, I do give my teams a lot of autonomy because it is their bed that they're making. And so if they see something and they've had 4 interviews with them and I've had 1, I'll typically say, okay, I might be wrong. I'll give them another chance.
I agree. I've actually watched some of my managers grow. I do have those things where I will kill it, but I've watched some of my managers grow to the place where they learn, right? Like I've let them make hires where I'm like, I don't think this will be successful because of this, but if you want to put your neck on the line, we can do it. And then I'll just hold them accountable at the 30-day mark. Last question, because I know we'll run out of time, but like, how do you make, maybe to the 30-day mark, like how do you make somebody that you've just hired successful? Do you have any tactics that work on that?
Yeah. It's a great question. I'll give my old boss a ton of credit. When I started ZoomInfo, I had a boss, Tim Strickland, and he set up for my first 2 weeks a one-on-one every day. Every day, he set it for an hour. Sometimes I only needed 30 minutes. And basically what he did, and I've taken this now to all of our senior leadership hires, is he's got a doc that's got everybody in the organization they're going to need to know. And depending on the role, we'll tweak that. And so basically giving these milestones, by the first 30 days, I need you to get through 50% of this list as far as connecting with these people. By 60 days, you need to get through the entire list. And we have this doc, this onboarding doc. And then I make the hiring manager, whether it's me for somebody in my direct reports or it's somebody below that, meet with them every day to fundamentally understand our business. And I don't think there is a more important time, because we are not a big like listening tour, take 6 months and hear about what's going on. We are a company of action and immediate action. And so getting folks up to speed where they can understand, how we report our metrics, what's the difference between gross adjusted renewal rate and net retention, understanding those things so that you can have a point of view quicker is paramount for us. And so we go through this rigorous boot camp. And from like an onboarding perspective, depending on the role, again, especially in leadership, I need you to know the product quickly. And again, a lot of people know it because they're coming from outside places, but we actually make them sit in with like all the salespeople on the product sections, because there's a prerequisite where I don't know your thoughts on this. I don't think there is any role in a company that does not need to fundamentally understand the ins and outs of the product. I don't care if you're P&A, I don't care if you're in sales, if you're in marketing, if you're in CIO's office, like you have to understand what it is we do. And so there's a big product focus. And then again, particular to that role, we've got these living, breathing documents that say, okay, if you're starting in RevOps, you need to know this person, this person, this person, this person. We need to check those boxes off. First 30 days, first 60 days, you need to have all of those people with a meeting set. And then we go through, here's all the metrics you're going to need to know. Here's the repository of the information. Here's the Salesforce documents. Here's the Tableau dashboards. Here are all of the different metrics that you're going to need to know, like the back of your hand. We just make it really clear so that there is no guesswork on like what's important. Well, I just spent an hour with our head of FP&A, even though I didn't need to. And that's great. And I think when people start at companies and they don't have that level of direction and they're left to their own devices, they walk around an office or they jump on Zoom and they're meeting with people. We want them to meet with the right people that they're going to be working with on a regular basis. We build those relationships. We almost force those relationships. And then, if you open our finance pack, it's 30 pages of metrics. And maybe they're relevant to you, maybe not. Here are the ones that matter. If you're in this side of the business, these are the things you're going to be judged on. These are the things that you're going to have to report out on. And what I loved about what Tim did with me is like every day we came in and it would be like a pop quiz. And it would be like, I know that you don't understand this particular conversion yet. I know you don't understand these particular channels yet. I know you like, and so every day it was like a forcing function to say, let's get a little bit better. And so when we come in this pop quiz, you'll be able to have more depth. And then I think one of the things that I really loved is we throw people in to the monthly operating review immediately.
Yep.
You don't get to sit on the sidelines. And I remember this, and I joke about it with Henry. I came into our monthly operating review at the end of January, the beginning of February to read out on January results. I'd been at the company 2.5 weeks, and I had to present on the customer business as if I'd been there for a year, and I got full yelled at literally 2.5 weeks in, like instant and immediate accountability, because it's like, it sets the tone. Because I think often, I'm sure you've seen it, where if you get lulled into this like, hey, learn, and hey, listening tour, and then like 6 months and everybody's been nice to you for 6 months, then when people start to hold you accountable, it feels very strange. And so like hitting that accountability early and often, but then giving them enough resources so that they can actually be held accountable faster, I think we've seen success with.
I love that. My last 2 CROs did that to me the every day. I honestly think by the end of 2 weeks, and so if it's not right, you call it a lot earlier. This is great. I I love this. I could go on for a long time. Maybe we'll do another one at some point, but thank you so much for the time on this. I'll go ahead and stop recording right now. Here we go.